Hi, this is Mike Gant, and this is episode 13 of Bible Studies. We're going through the book of Acts, and today we've come to Acts chapter 2, verses 22 through 24. So just to provide a little context, remind you of where we've been. We're in the book of Acts. The book of Acts is in the New Testament. It comes right after the four Gospels, which tell the life of Jesus, his death, and his resurrection from the dead. And they are the book of Acts is before the epistles, which is epistle is a formal letter. And these are the letters that the apostles sent to the churches that they started. And churches were just gatherings of people who believed what the apostles preached. They'd go to some public place or to a synagogue, and they would preach about Jesus rising from the dead according to the scriptures. And some people would believe him, other people would not believe him. Some of the people who didn't believe him would just walk away, shaking their heads. Other people who didn't believe him would throw rocks at him or do something else, try to kill him, trying to lock him up, trying to shut him up. But the people who believed them, they wanted to hear more, and they needed to hear more. I mean, it's not the kind of message someone comes in and preaches and then you're like, okay, got that, see you later. You need to know more. You need to be taught. And obviously Jesus came to create disciples, students, to be a teacher. So you got to have a method, a way of learning and all. So that's what the book of Acts, that's what the epistles come from. So in the middle of the book of Acts, and it tells about the apostles, not all of them, but primarily two of them, Peter and Paul. And we're on the day of Pentecost. This is the first day that the apostles have preached that Jesus rose from the dead. And the Holy Spirit has come just as Jesus had promised would happen. It was rather a miraculous scene. There were tongues of fire, like a tongue of fire above somebody's head. And I don't know exactly what that looked like, but that's just the way Luke described it, Luke being the author of the book of Acts. It says, and there appeared to them tongues as of fire distributing themselves, and they rested on each one of them. And they're all filled with the Holy Spirit and began speaking other languages or other tongues. So the tongue of fire, that sort of fit semantically with languages or tongues that people were speaking in. And they were speaking in languages that the one speaking didn't understand, but there'd be somebody else there who did understand, because this was the Feast of Pentecost, which was also called the Feast of Weeks. It was held 50 days after the Feast of First Fruits, these being Jewish feasts. And this was one of the Jewish feasts where Jewish males were required to come to Jerusalem, where the temple was, to celebrate this feast. And because Israel had been conquered a couple of times, northern Israel was conquered in 722 BC, and southern Israel, called Judah, was conquered in 586 BC. Jews were scattered all over the world because the conquerors would drive them out. The Jews would flee. Sometimes they were taken captive and they would go in these other lands. But the ones who could come back would come back for these three feasts each year, and this was one of them. So Peter starts off, or he's read to them from the book of Joel to explain that what they're seeing is not just a bunch of weirdness, but it is a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, specifically the prophet Joel, who was one of the 12 minor prophets. We've talked about that, and now we're at verse 22. Peter goes on to say, men of Israel. Okay, so these are the men who've come, who are Israelites, Jews, who've come from all over the world. He addresses the men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, or Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus that was raised in the town of Nazareth, a man, yes, Jesus was a man. He was more than a man, but he was a man. A man attested to you by God. How did God attest to Jesus? Peter says, with miracles and wonders and signs which God performed through him in your midst. Now, see, a lot of these Jews were from out of town, but a lot of them were from in town. Even the ones from out of town, not only from all sorts of places all over the world, but from other places in Israel, notably Galilee, which was a region to the far north of Israel, or the far north. It was in Israel, but it was in the far northern portion. God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. Jesus had done some miracles even that week that they had come in because, some of them had been there for the Passover previously when Jesus had done miracles. So because they had come to that feast too, that was roughly 50 days before, they would have seen some of these things. Peter goes on, this man delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. Now, Peter is speaking very precisely and very truly there. It technically wasn't the Jews who killed Jesus. Technically speaking, it was the Romans, because Jesus was crucified, and that was a Roman form of capital punishment. It wasn't a Jewish form. And it was the Roman authority, the governor of that area, Pontius Pilate, who had ordered this this execution. But it was the Jews who had put him up to it, specifically the Jewish leaders of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And Peter rightly says, he says, you Jews you nailed him to a cross by the hands of godless men, that's the Romans, and put him to death. The Romans were considered godless by the Jews. Now, none of this is to try to pin the blame on anybody except humanity. I mean, this is what human beings did to God, their creator. And if you and I had been there, are we going to say, I'll just speak for myself. Am I going to say, oh, I wouldn't have done anything wrong like they did? How do I know that? Anyone who's honest about themselves knows that he or she is capable of evil. It's a sad and sobering thing to recognize, but it's a terribly foolish thing to not recognize it. So when Peter says it's by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, he's making sure they understand, hey, look, Messiah, this Messiah that we Jews have been looking forward to for centuries, to be our king and to lead us to a better life. He's been crucified, and we're the ones that are we're part of the reason he was killed, because we played our part in this thing, and it was not Plan B. It wasn't, oh, we accidentally crucified the Messiah, or this is not Plan B. God's not having to scramble and figure, okay, what do I do now? I sent him a king and they killed him. How am I going to handle that? No, God knew he would be killed if he came to deliver his people. How could he know that? Because he knows the human heart. He knows what we're capable of. He knows we're capable of great evil. So this was all part of this messianic plan that he would come and he would be crucified, he would rise from the dead, and he actually wouldn't even start becoming king until after he'd been killed. So he knew the rejection would come even before he was made king. And then in verse 24, Peter goes on to say, but God raised him up again, putting an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible for him to be held in its power. How could it be impossible for him to be held in its power? Because he was more than just a man.